End of a conference is you find that everything you plan to say has already been said rather better by somebody else, or worse still, has been roundly repudiated by somebody else. And that's the position I find myself in. It was quite a good talk originally, but the good parts have been done, and the bad parts have been made to look foolish. So I'm going to soldier on. I must say in particular, you'll find a little bit of overlap with Richard, because while I've been adapting my paper throughout the conference, I can't do much now, and Richard and I have, he won't like to hear this, but we have quite a lot in common actually, and so a lot of what he said I'm afraid I will be echoing. Ostensibly I'm talking about empirical research into teaching, but I'd like to start, if I may, by asking you to consider research into physical health. Because I think that few would deny that over the centuries we've made enormous advances in our understanding and control of physical health. I mean, we've left the world of phrenology behind, you know, the world where you judge a person's character by the bumps on their head, even though it was taken seriously as little as about 100 years ago. But today we're far better at prognosis and prevention than we were, and far better at treatment and cure, whether by drugs, surgery, or lifestyle change. And by the way, I'm well aware of the wickedness of most pharmaceutical companies. I'm not suggesting it's all easy going in the world of physical health. Nonetheless, I would rather have my teeth extracted today than 400 years ago. And the progress that we've made has been essentially empirical. That is to say that while it's certainly wrong to see science as simply a matter of measurement, observation and experiment, since obviously conjecture, insight, hypothesis and theory are all crucially involved, nonetheless ultimately conclusions in the world of physical health have been empirically established. And the question I want to put before you is, why have we made such progress in this field? Why have we been able to empirically establish a large and convincing set of best practices in medicine that are truly transcultural? Practices that are effective in Turkey as they are in Scotland, practices that by and large don't vary in their efficacy with different sexes, different age groups, differences in wealth, different values, or different belief systems. And the answer is fourfold. First, generally speaking, the elements under consideration are clearly defined. We know the precise nature of drug X. We know what we mean by a malignant tumour. There is no lack of clarity about what constitutes a broken bone, pancreatic cancer, or a stroke. Secondly, not only are most of the concepts involved clearly defined, they are also, this being physical medicine, to a large extent physically monitorable. My computer, by the way, won't spell the word monitorable, so I hope it is a word, but I always get it underlined as if it didn't exist. But can be monitored is what I mean, if you're having a problem with it. We can, in some fairly direct sense, see whether or not a tumour is malign. We perceive the effects of a drug. We feel the broken bones. We smell decay. Thirdly, other variables that might affect the issue are relatively few, and again can be monitored and controlled for. The reason they're relatively few is partly a direct byproduct of working with relatively clear concepts and with concepts that can be monitored without unnatural distortion. But it's also partly that as a consequence, over time, we've built up a body of medical knowledge, such that we can now rule out thousands of what might once have had to be considered as potential variables. So we no longer need to consider, for instance, whether some new form of cancer is the consequence of the patient committing some crime, or the consequence of their impious thoughts, or the consequence of the size of their brain, or their being rejected as a child, or the failure of the corn crop. And because the number of potential variables is small, it is manageable as well as monitorable. But fourthly, and what to some extent makes the first three conditions operable, is the fact that we do not have any real disagreements, doubts or conceptual confusion or inadequacy over what counts as physical health. Self-evidently, if we didn't know anything about what constituted health, we would have no way of recognizing it, and hence no way of testing whether something did or did not contribute to it. It's because we agree on what counts as physical health, and because it's something that is ultimately observable, that we can engage in meaningful research into what contributes to it and what militates against it. So there seem to be at least four elements or factors involved in successful empirical inquiry here. Clear concepts, more or less directly monitorable concepts, a reasonable hope of anticipating and controlling for possible variables, and a clear conception of what constitutes success and failure in the field in question. I'd ask you now to consider in sort of contrast the field of mental health. Why is there considerably more disagreement and unease, sometimes quite extreme altercation in this field? And the answer is surely quite obvious. The four conditions noted in relation to physical health are not met in anything like the same degree in respect of mental health. First, the definitions, the concepts pertaining to mental states, are generally speaking extremely opaque, often confused, and sometimes downright disputed. What actually constitutes depression or even insanity is far from clear. Whether there is a definable state of post-traumatic stress, and if so, what causes it, other than the tautological trauma, is highly debatable. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, for instance, routinely, annually, redefines, removes, and creates new concepts. And this is not generally in response to new discoveries, as it might be in the natural sciences. Rather, it's what one might call, politely, a creative exercise. By giving a label to a set of possibly quite familiar behaviors, they seek to suggest a definable state of mind or affairs. By adding new labels, they both imply increasing mastery of the field and, of course, extend their remit. Thus, what used to be referred to as manic depressive tendencies, which was at the best of times no more than a crudely descriptive phrase referring to a behavior pattern, is now relabeled bipolarity. This change substitutes the technical and arcane language of the professional for everyday terminology, thereby distancing it from the understanding of the lay person. Secondly, at the same time, it subtly suggests that we are dealing with a known medical condition, something which can in principle be studied in itself and by extension treated. The fact of the matter, of course, is that we don't know anything significantly more about bipolarity than we knew about manic depressive tendencies. And it's far from clear that it's a condition that we can define and identify, let alone that we know a great deal about causes and appropriate treatment in particular cases. Similarly, what counts as autistic has proved a movable feast. The definition is constantly changing, generally speaking to become more embracing, and to some extent consequentially more vague. But labeling goes a long way towards suggesting that we are dealing with some definable state of mind of which we have full understanding. Unlike a broken leg or cancer, which are what they are regardless of your culture, time or preferences, what counts as eccentric, mad, depression, despair, misery and so forth is highly debatable and is without question to some extent culturally variable. For example, what used to be perceived, and still is, I think, in some cultures, as simply a failure to pay attention for one or more of a long list of possible but familiar reasons, is now exalted to the level of attention deficit disorder in North American culture, or ADD. The implication, of course, is that you have in some sense a tangible, observable, or otherwise locatable illness, comparable logically to a virus, a headache, or blood poisoning. But the notion that there is in some sense a condition that necessitates an inability to attend, as distinct from a failure to attend on different occasions, possibly for various different reasons, is no more than conjecture, and I have to say, in my view, pretty implausible conjecture. Once again, providing a label unwarrantably reinforces the idea of an identifiable condition. Thirdly, the potential variables that may affect mental health are far less well mapped and accounted for than in the field of physical medicine. Partly as a consequence of the two previous points, we don't have a significant prior body of knowledge to work from in the way that we do in physical medicine. We can rule out the time of the year as a possible cause of cancer, but can we rule it out in the case of depression? We can rule out what was eaten for lunch as the cause of a broken leg, but can we rule it out as contributory to a sense of well-being? And who knows what might improve a particular person's self-esteem or help another person cease to despair? My point here is simply that the list of possible variables that conceivably might have a strong bearing on mental states is enormously, and I would suggest unmanageably, longer than it is in the realm of physical health. But fourthly, and perhaps above all, the problem is that the concept of mental health is itself dramatically contested. Different cultures have different ideas about what is mentally healthy and what isn't. And there's also considerable variation within given cultures. And nor should we presume that because a group of professionals agree on some broad set of indices of healthy or unhealthy mental behavior, it follows that they have a clear conception. It does not follow, and it's generally not the case that they have a clear, shared concept of mental health, let alone that it's a plausible one. Now, the situation within education, in my view, is comparable to mental health, but worse. First, the various things that we want to consider, and therefore need to monitor if we're going to proceed empirically, include such things, and this is just a random list of examples, as progressive teaching style, caring, inspiring and motivating on the part of the teacher, and paying attention, enthusiasm and understanding on the part of the student. But all these and similar such concepts are on the face of it very unclear. But one thing we can say, secondly, is that to a very marked degree, such qualities, characteristics and styles are not directly observable or monitorable. Now, we could, of course, insist that since we want to conduct empirical research, we will ignore complex and not directly observable concepts such as interest, passion, understanding and appreciation, and focus instead on talk time, eye contact and attendance rates. And that, of course, is what researchers tend to do. But to proceed in that way is both to distort particular concepts and to dramatically limit, not to say emasculate, our overall picture of the enterprise of schooling and education. Whether a person is paying attention cannot be deduced from observation alone, unless one does what in fact researchers are driven to doing, defining the concept in observable terms, such as eyes on teacher or nods head as if in agreement, which clearly distorts the reality. It therefore, as likely as not, gives an incorrect reading. The student who has eye contact and nods her head is not necessarily paying any more or better attention than the one staring out of the window. At least I've always hoped that was true in my own lectures. In addition to ignoring and distorting various important concepts, empirical research for the most part focuses on short-term results. This, I think, is largely a result of practical needs of the business of research. From the point of view of the individual, the more you can do quickly and get results, the better for your career. More generally, it's extremely costly to do long-term research, and in other ways impractical to seek to follow through in order to see what effect particular educational experiences have on pupils in later life. Also, of course, it becomes immeasurably more difficult to establish the effects that education, as distinct from various other factors in life, may have had. But success or lack of it in education should surely, ideally, be judged from a long-term point of view. Whether one is thinking in terms of something relatively mundane, such as learning the Times tables, or responses to poetry, or the development of insight and compassion, one would expect and hope that educators would be more concerned about what schooling has meant to individuals over the course of their lives than what it shows students to have achieved at the end of a given year or on leaving school. Thirdly, the variables that potentially need to be considered as possibly affecting what is going on are, as in most cases of human interaction, effectively numberless. In the physical or natural sciences, we can, for the most part, confine ourselves to physical phenomena. The mood of the observer, the temperament of the observed, do not, generally speaking, come into it. But in the teaching situation, any number of psychological and sociological, biological and physical, emotional and intellectual factors may play a part. What a particular student gets out of a particular lesson may owe as much to his or her hunger, resentment, prior learning, headache, general inability to concentrate, and so on and so forth, as anything specifically to do with teaching or learning. So the first problem lies in thinking out what variables need to be controlled for. This is partly because of the absence of a developed body of knowledge, akin to that in the natural sciences, which has already narrowed the field by eliminating various factors as irrelevant. It's partly because the lack of clear concepts makes it hard to rule anything out. If we're dealing with something as open yet opaque as enthusiasm, how do we begin to imagine what might or might not affect it? And if we're not sure what counts as being well educated, how can we begin to shortlist factors that might affect it? But I would add that it also just seems to be the case that there's an enormous number of things that may affect a child's progress through school, in a way that there's not an enormous number of things that might conceivably cause physical sickness of one kind or another, or that might help or hinder the growth of a plant. And we're told, for example, that students have an optimum attention span in lectures. I have to say, first of all, I doubt very much whether the claim is true, even as a generalization. It doesn't matter what the period in question is. We're told that there is an optimum time, an optimum length during which you can expect students to pay attention. As I say, I doubt whether such a claim can be true, even as a generalization. I would think it obviously depends partly on the age of the students in question, the activity in question, the lecturer, and so on and so forth. But even if it were true, to the extent that in a given culture, students tend to pay attention for a certain period of time only, it would obviously not necessarily be true for all cultures. Why is that? Because our ability to concentrate is very obviously partly governed by practice, expectation, and experience. Greek rhapsodes, for example, could recall and recite the entire Homeric corpus of poetry. Most of us, alas, today cannot recite a short poem by Tennyson. Why is that? Because these things are not given in nature, they are primarily the product of need, training, practice, and acclimatization, and we no longer expect of our children this kind of memorization. The reason that people can't pay attention for long in contemporary Canadian culture is that their way of life and the fewer demands made on them in respect of paying attention and of related achievement positively cultivates such inability. Fourthly, and most importantly, and most obviously, the end is not clear. What counts as success is neither spelt out nor agreed on. Education being a prime example of what W.B. Galley famously called an essentially contested concept. I am, of course, mindful here of David Carr's excellent opening paper when he drew a distinction which I did venture to raise a doubt about, but nonetheless a distinction between senses of a word and different conceptions. But even if I concede everything to David, which I tend to do because it makes life easier, it's not going to affect my argument here, I don't think. But I just want to make it clear I'm not ignoring the possibility that you know, he wants to, in some sense, say let's not get hung up on this notion of an essentially contested concept. Sometimes it isn't that at all. Okay, let's allow that. I think what I'm going to say, as I say, will not be affected. Now, it happens that I share the view, most fully expounded by Richard Peters, who's been mentioned many times, that to be educated is at least to have a developed understanding that is both broad and worthwhile, and that involves cognitive perspective and commitment. And I think that one may reasonably assert that historically and cross-culturally, it's evident that most, if not all people, in fact share this view. They may not realize they do, but if we talk about it and explain precisely what it means and the limits that it involves, then I don't think many people would deny it. But even if we accept that, so this is accepting a kind of core to the notion of education, which is ungainsayable, even if we accept that, any more detailed specification of being educated is going to depend upon a host of culturally variable factors, including, but I'd like to stress by no means only, differences in values. It's often differences in sort of empirical beliefs that affect our views of things like education. It's not always just values that we argue about. Bearing in mind, then, that despite my commitment to the notion of a core meaning of education, bearing in mind that for some people a well-educated person is, for example, a Renaissance scholar, whereas for other people it's simply one who has a limited set of marketable skills, what on earth is one to make of the claim that research shows that such and such a teaching method is effective? Full stop. Period. Without qualification. What are we to make of the claim that this is best practice, or the appropriate method? Effective to what end? Best in the light of what view of success? The appropriate method in respect of what cultural ideal? Now, in practice, as we've seen, it's always a short-term end or set of ends, and an end that is observable or monitorable. That's to say, we continue to see success defined in short-term, monitorable terms. Even in the university context, we see it happening as we're increasingly confronted with assessment exercises. These are allegedly concerned with quality of our teaching and scholarship, but in fact, they're nothing more than quantitative counts of our publications, of monitorable activities such as conference attendance, of grant dollars brought in, and of student perceptions of our competence. I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience that scribbling a lot of books doesn't necessarily make a man wise or a good scholar, and that the lecturers whom students favour or like are not necessarily the best lecturers. While failing to bring in research funding, failing to bring as much research funding as a colleague, if it's done for the simple, or not done, for the simple and excellent reason that one doesn't require it, is surely to be praised rather than penalised. And as to the conspicuous waste involved in attending conferences, I will say no more, given the august nature of this particular occasion. Just as it's true, in other words, that as E.C. Boring, a name I love, E.C. Boring, the IQ researcher, said, IQ is simply what IQ tests, so it's true that what empirical researchers mean by educational success is simply success on their instruments and tests. The crucial question is thus whether their view of success is sufficiently compelling, whether short-term success on their tests and instruments, usually of observable skills, is satisfactory as a definition of educational success. In my view, it never is, it never has been, and it never can be. Now, we've had a good 100 years of empirical research into teaching, and I wouldn't deny that we do get some truths at the end of it. But for the most part, they are necessary truths, along the lines of good teachers interest their students, good teachers are with it, and good teachers get students to spend time on task. These, though possibly true, are banal and unhelpful, since what interests is far from constant among all people, what counts as being with it is negotiable, and the question is how much time, and the answer to such a question will vary from student to student and task to task. What we don't get are findings that may plausibly be said to be both significant and unexpected, and thirdly, to have required systematic or formal empirical research to uncover them. Now, I've been criticised in the past on the grounds that even if I'm right in saying that research has not produced many, if any, significant laws of teaching, it's nonetheless unreasonable of me, for example, to quote, and I'm quoting here, to fail to take notice of a body of research that found that a high percentage of a large number of autistic children found it easier to follow instructions that were written down rather than communicated orally. That is a quotation, and it's slightly oddly worded, so I'll just read it again. The charge made against me was that I am unreasonable, which may be true, but this was the reason that I am unreasonable, which may not be true. I am unreasonable because I failed to take notice, for example, of a body of research that found that a high percentage of a large number of autistic children found it easier to follow instructions that were written down rather than communicated orally. But if I did ignore such research, how unreasonable am I being? Now, the specific numbers in question are not given here, but if we generously assume that both the large number and the high percentage, referred to in this quotation from Lorraine Foreman Peck, by the way, are 75% of their totals, then we're being told that 75% of a group of autistic children respond better to written instruction. That is in fact to say that 56 out of 100 autistic children studied responded better. Now, this does not seem to me to constitute particularly helpful information for a teacher faced with her own class of autistic children, not the 100 involved in the study in question. I would say, 56 out of 100, I would say, given the odds, she would be far better advised to study the particular students in her own class and draw her own conclusions about what they, being the individuals they are, even if we label them all autistic, need than to proceed unthinkingly in line with a very broad generalization, based inevitably, for reasons that I've given, on inappropriate and hence inadequate research methodology. But I've also been criticised for failing to make it clear as to whether I reject all empirical research in education. So I'm glad to take this opportunity to say, of course not. It might be the case that all, or even let's just say 90% of autistic children respond better to written instructions after extensive, repeated study. If such were the case, it might be possible to carry out research that convincingly established the conclusion, and if it were true, I would regard it as useful information. But my argument so far has been, point one, that this could only be convincingly researched if first we had a clear and convincing conception of autism, if secondly that conception were something that is indeed monitorable, without distortion, and if thirdly we could rule out all other possible factors so as to be sure that it is being autistic in itself that determines a preference for written instruction, none of which in my view is the case. And my argument has also been, point two, that such conditions have certainly not been met in research into generic teaching methods. Now, it's also been suggested that you notice how much criticism of me there seems to be around. I don't fully understand it, but wherever I look, I'm criticised. It's been suggested that I fail to appreciate the extent to which researchers have produced strikingly counterintuitive claims that, being counterintuitive, illustrate both the value of such research in general and the fact that there are significant rules to be found. Now, a good example of this is provided by recent research at Stanford, of which I have to confess that I only have informal knowledge, gathered from a public lecture given by Dennis Phillips. He didn't know I was going to take note of this. I may have misunderstood him. I may have got this wrong. I'm sure that if I have, we will be told, but not yet, please. I don't think, again, it makes any difference, actually. Even if I misunderstood him, let's assume this is a fictional example, it still makes the point I want to make, I think. But I hope I didn't misunderstand him. In this research, the seemingly obvious assumption that teachers should make themselves clear to their students is shown to be not necessarily true. The research shows that some students actually benefited from their teachers being unclear. Well, as a matter of fact, I can well believe that. So I don't question the integrity of the research, which obviously you appreciate I have not studied firsthand anyway, so I've got to be careful here. But I don't find this amazing or problematic. Such a finding, in my view, is both easily explained and in fact confirms my point that research is not producing meaningful and useful findings. It's explainable in a number of ways. Perhaps the students were preparing for final exams or something important, and frustrated by the lack of clarity on the part of their teachers, they went off to the library and gave themselves a good education by means of Google or whatever. Perhaps they were just generally highly motivated students. Perhaps they were irritated and determined to show their teachers a thing or two. Perhaps in this case certain peers in the group were more influential than the teacher. Who knows, there could be many, many reasons why a group of people faced with a teacher who is unclear nonetheless perform ultimately in some way extremely well. Whatever the explanation, it's clear that the conclusion from this piece of research is that far from there being rules of good teaching, and far from this being a useful research finding, even seemingly self-evident good teaching practices do not always work, and are not in every case appropriate. Presumably, the researchers are not going to claim to have established the counterintuitive proposition that teachers should generally be unclear. What they've established is that sometimes a lack of clarity may be productive, from which I would draw the obvious conclusion, and that is that even when it comes to something like being clear, there are no hard and fast rules in teaching. Now, my general argument so far has been largely about the plausibility of the idea of our being able to discover generic rules or laws of good teaching by a process of systematic empirical inquiry. But the example relating to clarity highlights the possibility that the reason the research is getting us nowhere is that there are no rules to be found. In the natural sciences, we look for laws that transcend cultural difference. Indeed, it was the growing realization that there were rules and the subsequent discovery of many of them that gave rise to the very idea of science. Because we can locate laws in nature, we have the natural sciences. In the domain of the social sciences, so-called, we proceed as scientists without having any prior assurance that there are any laws. Now, as already said, the notion of laws governing teaching is highly suspect. Even being clear, it transpires, is not always desirable. Now, of course, I'm not disputing that there are rules of thumb, rough and ready practical guides that are worth handing on to teachers. And those rules would in fact include something like be clear. Despite what we've just discovered, my advice to an aspirant teacher would B, try and be clear, seems very good advice. And there are other such things that we can pass on. Speak clearly, don't intimidate, be encouraging, vary your approach, and so on. But such rules are of limited value inasmuch as they need interpreting, they are only generalizations, and they're fairly self-evident. They do not require an expensive research program to validate them, and they do not amount to a set of best practices or laws. So I would like to suggest that the findings of empirical researchers in respect of teaching are generally speaking unhelpful and questionable. But they're also, I think, potentially dangerous. Less thoughtful teachers, teacher educators and administrators, assuming that since academic research is highly funded, since it is, quote, scientific, and since it's carried out by, quote, experts, it must be significant, may simply accept the conclusion that what matters is to follow the findings. The notion that there are rules naturally tends to promote the idea that good teachers are those who know them and follow them. That tends in turn to lead to practitioners who accept various prescriptions rather than those who take responsibility for analysing each situation for themselves. Thus, the view that we can establish the laws of teaching gets in the way of something supremely important. And here I begin to go parallel with Richard. Namely, our understanding of the fact that human actions and interactions are by their nature unique. It is our individuality that is being ignored, the particularity of every human encounter, and in turn our recognition that we are responsible for our actions. We are not victims of circumstance. We cannot live our lives fully and successfully by prescript. Now, I should also say that though this is a philosophy conference and I tend to just focus on sort of philosophical interest, this is a matter of huge practical importance because empirical research has become a huge industry. It's our tax dollars that are paying for this nonsense. And as already been mentioned, evidence-based research, which in a sense we're all in favour of, and we all value that people should have evidence, but it's been wrongly equated with empirical research. So huge sums of money are spent on empirical research projects in the social sciences, and in my view, the findings tend to be the driving engine in policy decision-making in North America and Britain. By contrast, philosophy, along with the humanities generally, tends to be dismissed by government and policymakers as being of no economic utility, and therefore, by their inadequate reasoning, of no practical value. Because these are people, in Oscar Wilde's words, who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. It seems to me that this is all upside down. Because social scientists call themselves scientists and proceed by aping the ways of the natural sciences, it's assumed that they are productive of knowledge, scientific information being regarded by administrators and policymakers as the only true knowledge. But scientific knowledge is not the only kind of knowledge there is, nor perhaps ultimately the most important. Social science, when it's genuinely scientific, covers only a limited field of human endeavour, and much of the time, not least in the field of education, actually has very little of importance to tell us. By contrast, philosophy has enormous practical value. First, as I hope has become clear from what I've said, but more from what other people have said throughout the conference, Richard in particular was addressing this, more because it's crucial in clearing the ground, sweeping away confusion and false assumptions that get in the way of sound thinking and sane practice, such as Dennis's paper as well, just basic errors that people are making, which are leading them to then proceed to behave in stupid ways. Philosophy is essential too and of inestimable practical value in carrying out the necessary constructive work of analysing and clarifying our key concepts. In particular, it's logically necessary as the means to establish our goal, the ideal towards which we're striving. And when it comes to this positive role, we should not be put off by the admission that many key concepts are essentially contested, if we accept that phrase. We may not all agree on the finer points of what constitutes being well educated, but we can establish the formal but fundamental and necessary conditions of being educated, and we can, each one of us, come to a clear, coherent and fully developed conception such that we collectively know what we're variously talking and arguing about. I think one important positive point made by philosophers about teaching is that it's a polymorphous term. That's to say, teaching cannot be defined in terms of a specific activity, such as instruction, or facilitating, or monitoring. Nor in practice can it even be defined in terms of a definitive set of activities, for the truth is that in teaching one may and should engage in countless different kinds of activity at various different times. I did think at this point of just falling over as if in a dead faint, in order to illustrate the point. I mean, I didn't do so because I thought it would worry my friends who would actually care about me or something. But had I done that, I'm pretty sure that it would have been the one thing you would have remembered from this presentation, and you'd have remembered the point that I'm making, that almost anything can be a bona fide teaching act, something that is useful. It just simply depends what you're trying to do. So it is absolutely pointless to try and tie teaching down or define it in terms of a set of particular activities. And I think this is a point that needs to be emphasized given the widespread tendency of educators to dismiss activities that they don't approve of as, quote, not really teaching, as in, oh, she's not really teaching, she's just lecturing, or call that teaching, I call it a love-in. Philosophy may further help us to realize that we're perhaps completely wrongly orientated. Now, I've been talking about empirical research into teaching methods, albeit very critically, because the world we live in has emphasized and dignified such work. But perhaps when it comes to producing teachers, it's not discussion of methods or techniques that we need at all, so much as consideration of the type of character that we require in teachers. Now, at this point, I begin to falter. You'll be glad to know I'm near the end, but I begin to falter because of Chris Winch's paper, where he referred to the English Secretary of State, Michael Gove, and I don't think Chris totally approved of some of what Michael Gove has to say. I was going to talk about English private schools, which was pretty brave of me anyway. I certainly won't do that now, but I will say that there are, I think, and have been historically, and are in many cultures, good schools where success in producing people of a certain character and attainment is certainly not the result of the teachers concerned being fitted out with a uniform set of teaching skills. Indeed, it's not the result of the teachers being fitted out with any particular teaching skills, because I'm referring to schools which are famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, for not requiring formal teaching certification or training for their teachers of any sort. Just to make this clear, if you're not familiar with this, there are plenty of schools, at any rate in England, which have had teachers who don't have to have, or it may be changing, but in my youth, didn't have to have any formal training. So what were they looking for when they made appointments? Well, this is where I get a little bit sounding like Michael Gove, but I don't think Chris disagrees with this. I think you merely want a lot more to be taken account of too. Anyway, what I think they want and what I think Michael Gove wants and what I want are teachers who are first and foremost well educated themselves. And I do mean something more than prepared to be teachers, however we define teacher preparation. I want them to be broadly well educated. Secondly, I think that the teachers I'm thinking of are generally appointed because they are thought to be primarily motivated by a love of their subject and an enthusiasm for imparting that love. And thirdly, that they are motivated also by a wider desire to see a world of cultured, civilized people, all of which we may need to further analyze in terms of the precise meaning, but you'll at least understand what I'm getting at. The notion of trying to get teachers not as if they were somehow people with a set of observable expertise skills, but people who are of a certain intellectual and moral type. There's obviously no necessary either-or here, but I would contrast the emphasis I'm putting there with the tendency for the professional bodies, including things like teachers' unions and teacher training establishments, at least in my part of the world, to stress things like caring for kids, techniques of teaching, protocols for lesson plans and report cards, and commitment to some kind of social agenda, rather than the sorts of things that I'm emphasizing. What we really need, I think, if we're to improve our system, is to insist that schools should focus primarily on character development and a love of learning, and we need institutions that have a strong culture of their own, a culture of quality that speaks up for quality and for the importance, again, this has been said before, of making judgments, an obligation on the part of anybody seriously interested in education that nonetheless seems to be somewhat threatening to too many contemporary educationalists. Most of all, I think, hope for the future depends upon commitment to a shared vision. Teacher education should therefore focus not on how to teach, but on why we are teaching in the first place. What is it all for? What is our concept of educational success? And that's a job for philosophy. What I've tried to suggest is that most empirical educational research, given the fact that it is empirical, which is to say by definition focused on the observable and immeasurable, proceeds as if and reinforces the idea that humans are essentially no more than automata who respond to stimuli. Philosophy reminds us that humans are not simply sophisticated machines or relatively complex animals, still less inanimate matter. Our possibly unique kind of linguistic capacity has led to the development of our minds, which in turn give us autonomy. We do not simply behave, we for the most part act intentionally and in the light of our reasoning, regardless of how inadequate or adequate our reasoning may be. To understand humans and their interaction, one needs to understand their reasoning, to enter their minds, to know their intentions. To understand any given human situation, one needs to understand its particularity. The ideal teacher seeks to develop in the student understanding and appreciation of, engagement with and commitment to worthwhile subject matter. To do that successfully requires primarily a clear idea of what that subject matter is and why one is studying it, and an openness to how one should proceed, coupled with the realization that how best to proceed has to be determined by combining insight into the particular situation with a firm eye on what one is ultimately trying to achieve or contribute to. In any business or activity, without an understanding of what you're trying to achieve, what constitutes a successful outcome, what you're aiming at, you cannot coherently plan your campaign, evaluate the steps along the way, or judge your success or lack of it. That understanding is what philosophy provides, and that is why philosophy matters in education. Thank you very much.
Well, questions? Well,
the paper is said, teacher preparation should be based upon philosophical inquiry into the nature of the enterprise rather than an attempt to pass on the science of teaching, etc. The kind of world we have today, different cultures, different countries, different philosophical, social, economic aspects, how can we apply this theory on a universal basis? Is it possible in the realities of today?
Yes, I mean, I think it is possible. I have to admit I've changed my views during my lifetime. When I sort of first began my career in philosophy, I was tempted to and tried to argue for a view, a sort of Platonic view, that if philosophers did the job properly, we would all agree on what education is or whatever. I've moved a long way from that, but I still think that the important thing would be not, I mean, as I say, I think there are things that anything that's going to count as education in any culture must involve. I really would find it incomprehensible if somebody said, here is a country that educates people, but it isn't concerned about understanding at all. But I think that what we get, and I think what Peters, for example, gave us, is fairly basic. And once we've agreed that we are, amongst other things, and I don't rule out things like compassion and emotional development and so on, but once we've agreed that we want understanding of worthwhile things or whatever, then I think there will be cultural variation, and I think what matters is simply to have that debate within a culture. Now, one might then say that because within a culture there are always subcultures. I mean, you could go on forever. So is everybody in India going to agree? Not necessarily, but I think that the more one has the debate, the more one will find agreement. And I think this is an imperfect world. That's all we can strive for. And I would, of course, go on the offensive and say, at any rate, it's better than following mindlessly a whole lot of rules that alleged scientists think should dictate to us all. But I mean, I think it's a challenge. I agree.
So it was quite insightful, giving me ideas on what are the research that I should not do. But two questions. One, I think, let me just take your example of physical health and mental health. If I understood correctly, the lack of a knowledge base was seen as a problem in the case of mental health. So in that case, there is a case for building up the knowledge base, or are you saying that such a building of knowledge base is impossible in the case of education? Well, that's one question. Second question is, I told you that I'm a social scientist, but I'm an economist.
The dismal science.
So, question. some costs of not research or not doing research. I will encounter situations where the cost of not doing research or non-research is much higher.
Okay, let me take the first question first and the second question first. First question is absolutely fair. Yes, you obviously can only build up a body of knowledge by doing something. Science has done that, and you could say give social science time and it will do. I'm sceptical of that for the other reasons I've given, and I merely mean at the moment, I'm being a bit specific here, not making so much of a general point, so I accept your kind of criticism. I'm simply very wary of contemporary empirical research and education because it hasn't got that, and therefore I think isn't very imaginative, which is all we can do, about thinking of possible causes of things. On the second question, and this is the trouble, we're all getting so old and it's getting so late, I've forgotten what it was already, but just remind me, economics, yes, no, this is a harder, I'm not happy with myself here. I mean, I don't think any of us are. We get up, we give a paper, and we know that we really should qualify everything. I mean, if I wanted to make an excuse for myself, I would say that I wasn't entirely joking. I came here with twice the number of pages, and I've had to cross out this, out, or the other. So it comes out as a much more blunt, hard line than it perhaps need be. But anyway, I think one tends to do that. I mean, one doesn't... And if one wrote a paper on anything where one tried to recognize all the problems, all the variables, one would probably spend the rest of one's life and it would become several books. I don't wish to have given the impression, which I have in the past, I know, I thought I'd try to avoid it today, but I don't wish to give the impression that I think all empirical research is absurd and a waste of time. I have to say, I can't resist saying, simply because of the world we're currently living, that dear old economics does not inspire me with confidence, given the world situation right now, but no doubt somebody has the answer somewhere. But in general, no, I accept that we should carry on. But what I would like to do is to stop spending enormous amounts of money and stop judging the worth of people in universities by how much money they bring in, to conduct these vast empirical exercises in the case of education into things that I think are not really worth pursuing.
Over the last 2 years I've been interacting with students of a research methodology course, and we've been trying to explore this question, that when we say that our research methodology has to be scientific, can we arrive at some criteria from a philosophical analysis of method of science of which questions are researchable and which are not? And how can we, when is it possible to convert a question into a researchable proposition to ensure that, you know, we don't end up with absurd...
Well, I think we could. I won't try and do it now. I about the fact that there isn't just one way of establishing things as more or less warranted. There are different ways of establishing different kinds of claim. And I'm certainly not saying that, you know, nobody can establish any truth for a start. I'm simply saying that we ought to be more careful about assuming I think there's a confusion between scientific procedure, that's to say the outward trappings of proceeding science, and assuming that because you're doing that, it's genuine science. It's got to be appropriate to the problem. And what I've tried to suggest today is that it very often isn't. And so part of my answer to you, I won't repeat it all, would be, well, the first thing you must do is, if you want to observe something, make sure it's observable. And if you say no, and this of course could be said, no, I agree that, I'll keep the example simple because I've used it, I agree that paying attention is not fully caught by things like whether people keep eye contact. Nonetheless, it's a reasonable working sort of index. Well, I guess we could debate that, but I don't think it is. I mean, I'm sort of joking apart. I'm quite serious. I actually these days face people, I'm ashamed to say, in my lectures who are, to all appearances, asleep. I mean, you know, their eyes are closed and they seem to be snoring, so I guess they're asleep. Some of these people, very few, but some of these people have been known to tell me when I perhaps quietly try to remonstrate with them, no, actually, you know, I'm finding this really rather interesting. And it turns out that they obviously are because of what they can say and do. So I think you've got to be very careful, what I'm saying. So I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, as we always do. I think it is possible, but I think we should bear in mind different kinds of proposition need to be warranted, or we attempt to warrant them or show them not warrantable in different ways and to different degrees as well.
Lady at the back.
Whatever I said about empirical research almost applies to assessment as well.
about things being observable and measurable. So it's an extreme derivation from what you said, that shouldn't we assess the outcomes or learning that happens in our classrooms?
I would give the same reply to that more or less as Richard gave to a similar but different question. Yes, I think we should be assessing, but no, I don't think we should be assessing everything in this particular... you laugh at me, but I haven't finished my sentence. I think we should be assessing, but not assessing in a scientific way, except in rare instances. I mean, there are some things. Perhaps if you just want to know whether somebody's mastered the times tables, there's nothing wrong with just asking them to repeat them. But in general, and this has been said by many people, and of course this would be at the heart of my wider views rather than what I'm just talking about today, we surely care, and I'm sure this applies to most people in this room, we're not interested in just being able to do things like, say, 2 times 2 equals 4. We're only interested in that as a means to an end. We are interested in human beings, being as fully developed as possible, etc., etc. We're interested in people with passion, emotion, concern. We're interested in all sorts of things, and these can be assessed, but not by the sort of instruments that we tend to use at the moment. They can be assessed, I would prefer to say, judged. They can be judged, and judgment is an art, not a science. But there are criteria for judging. I mean, people sometimes move from judgment is an art, not a science, to the assumption that judgment is whatever turns you on. No, judgment is not what turns you on. Judgments can be well or badly made. But I do not think that there is a way of, as it were, giving a definitive, concrete, precise answer to the question of how successful we've been in the overall task of trying to educate. I think all we can do is say it's pretty clear in this society, looking around us, that we aren't doing as well as we might, which anyway is all we need to be concerned about, always making more effort to achieve what we want to achieve.
This question is inspired by your last few lines in response to, rightly, I'm in full, I'm 100% in agreement with whatever you said, and it really goes...
What I have said.
No, whatever you have said till now, so I'm very emphatic about it. But, roughly, if I could paraphrase it, you seem to be locating, educational inquiry into the domain of art, instead of into the domain of ease. But, once we do that, then again that question of who's, who is going to decide art, etc., those creep into the educational discourse, and again we go towards relativism, against which probably, we ourselves want to guard from. So it's kind of gets into a vicious circle. So I would just...
I think there are 2 aspects to my answer to that, if I've understood it rightly. First of all, I do generally think that we're living... Again, I should have said at the beginning, of course, but I'm sure you realise this. Like Richard, this is my first trip to India, and I'm delighted to be here, and I did a little bit of homework on the way, but I don't understand or know enough about India. I'm talking from the context that I know, and I think that in Canada, and I think United States, and I think Britain, educational theory, England I should say, educational theory is dominated by and large by one or more of the social sciences. So to that, I am trying to argue against that. I'm trying to say we've got to get philosophy in there. Social science is overrated. It cannot do as much as it thinks. It's often very badly done, but it might be improved in some cases. And we need philosophy in it. I think ultimately building up an educational view probably should be called an art rather than a science, remembering that these are just broad labels that can be defined differently themselves, but in as much as I don't think you're ever going to scientifically establish everything that matters in education. So you're going to have to exercise judgment, which brings me to the second element in what you've asked, if I understood it rightly. You seem, and forgive me if I've got you wrong, you seem to be assuming that when we go to the world of art and judgments, then it's all relative, which which some people do, of course, and that is something that I think we have to resist. I think the argument that presumes that is just faulty. So the question of who sort of makes the judgment as to what we're doing is, I think, only answerable in terms of we do by sort of organized, systematic, intelligent discussion, taking into account the social sciences, because whatever criticism I've made of it, nobody is disputing that there are empirical assumptions we have to make. I mean, there's not much doubt that part of what we do is affected by individual psychology and by general psychology of humans. My question about psychology is simply how sort of deferential should we be to every claim that the field of psychology makes? And my answer would be very, very undeferential, because I think they make a lot of claims that simply they're not entitled to make. But if you look at it differently and say that there are lots of observations that are worth bearing in mind and that you need to take a view on because there are questions, then I think one needs to raise these questions. So I suppose what I'm really calling on is for the social sciences to pursue their questions scientifically only where they can do so, and to recognize that when they pursue the other questions, which they're perfectly to be encouraged to do in a non-scientific way, that they are very much more cautious, because I think they will have to be more cautious about drawing conclusions and so on and so forth.
We have time for two more questions. Chris Winch, and then someone up here on the stage wants to ask a question.
Very quickly, you use the term science and scientific, and I take it you're particularly concerned with those forms of inquiry which take the natural sciences, and in particular the so-called hard natural sciences, as a paradigm for research. I wonder what your view is of the broader notion of scientific inquiry, more captured by the German term Wissenschaft, systematic inquiry into an aspect of reality. And it seems to me that doesn't preclude some pretty careful conceptual work which may involve an empirical element as well, such as finding out exactly what the concepts in use are amongst different people and different cultures as a preliminary to collecting more data.
Yeah, you're quite right on your first point that I was thinking of a narrow definition. I should have. One of the things I cut out was that I was going to start off by stressing that what particularly sort of motivates me here is a concern about generic research of the type you shouldn't lecture, you should work in small groups, as if it didn't matter who you were, what you were, and so on. I did not mean to imply, and I would accept the value, I would hope that it would be rigorous, which I'm sure sometimes it is and sometimes it clearly isn't, but I would not, I mean, all forms of particular, a lot of people have problems about particular studies of situations and drawing inferences from it. I don't have a problem with that as long as we know that's what, as long as it's done well and we know that's what we're doing. My problem really is with these sweeping claims about particular practices and the approach to teacher education that focuses on that. I should add another particular thing, and again, I'm sorry, I mean, these parochial things do affect what one says and perhaps shouldn't, but the institution where I work, Simon Fraser University, has a very, I think, unusual feature, at least I hope it's unusual, in its pre-service program. It does not group people into things like the maths module or the science module or the English literature module, i.e. would-be teachers who are going to teach English. It doesn't even do it into elementary and secondary. It puts them all together in things with strange names, like the evergreen module or the whatever. And its point is that it is not going to talk about, say, somebody who's planning to be a history teacher to 14-year-olds. It's not going to talk about that at all. It's going to talk about pedagogy only in generic terms. Although in our case it isn't based on science, it's based on ideology, which is equally bad. But that is a concern for me. I mean, the kind of research that I think is valuable, empirical of whatever sort, is more likely to be, you know, we have done a study of how to, of teaching a particular math problem or issue in a particular way with a particular age group. That, it seems to me, can be illuminating.
This session illustrates to me one of the great virtues and delights of belonging to the philosophy of education community. You can have very strong disagreements with each other, as Robin and I do, but still enjoy each other's company and still find it stimulating to argue. And I hope the younger members of the audience will have 50 years of fun arguing with the person next door. I'm going to restrain myself from rising to the bait of responding to Robin, but Richard is going to give in to ask a question.
Yes, you made a very interesting point towards the end of your talk, really about what we need really for teachers is to have been to a good school, and you referred then to the sort of private schools, which no doubt you had in mind, places like Eton and Westminster, went to a decent university, no doubt you have in mind Oxford, and just loved their subject, were properly educated people, and that really is all that you need. I'm just wondering, though, whether you really think, and of course one has in mind our present cabinet and our present Prime Minister, who went to these institutions and spent their time when they were there dressed in fancy clothes belonging to the Bullingdon Club, and because they had lots and lots of money, spent their time smashing up these restaurants, but had enough money to pay for it. So this is the educated lot that you're obviously very pleased with. But don't you think that if they would have produced a more equal society, a society which is much less, as it were, differentiated between the very rich and the very poor, that is less sexist, that has a concern for the poor, that is less concerned with filling the pockets of its banker friends, don't you think they would have been much better able to think about human flourishing had they been to a decent comprehensive school and educated by teachers who are properly trained to enable them to think more widely about these issues?
Well, Richard knows, which you don't, that I went to Westminster and Oxford, and had the education I had in mind. There's no answer to that. I don't think the people that Richard is cursing. I'm not particularly enamored of them, but I don't think they're evil actually. And I certainly don't think the alternative is particularly welcome either. I think I'll just flounder to a halt and admit defeat on this. There is no answer. It's not fair to put me on after him and then give him the last word, which is what has been done.
This was a historic occasion, Robin Barrow being speechless, so let's thank him.